All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. We're still on Changing Economic Patterns, page 550, The Pluralist Economy and World Blocks. The economic disasters of two wars, a world depression, and the post-war fluctuation showed clearly by 1960 that a new economic organization of society was both needed and available. The laissez-faire competitive system had destroyed itself and almost destroyed civilization as well by its inability to distribute the goods it could produce. The system of monopoly capitalism had helped in this disaster and clearly showed that its efforts in fascist countries to protect its profits and privileges by authoritarian government and ultimately by war were unsuccessful because it could not combine conservatism in economic and social life with the necessary innovation and freedom in military and intellectual life to win the wars it could start. Moreover, communism, on the winning side of the war, nonetheless showed that it, like any authoritarian system, failed to produce innovations, flexibility, and freedom. It could make extensive industrial advances only by copying freer peoples and could not raise its standard of living substantially because it could not combine lack of freedom and force in political life and in the utilization of economic resources with the increased production of food and spiritual or intellectual freedom, which were the chief desires of its own peoples. This almost simultaneous failure of laissez-faire, of economic fascism, and of communism to satisfy the growing popular demand both for rising standards of living and for spiritual liberty has forced the mid-20th century to seek some new economic organization. This demand has been intensified by the arrival on the scene of new peoples, new nations, and new tribes who, by their demands for those same goods, have shown their growing awareness of the problem and their determination to do something about them. As this new group of underdeveloped peoples look about, they have been struck by the conflicting claims of the two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The former offered the goods the new peoples wanted, rising standard of living and freedom, while the latter seemed to offer methods of getting these goods by state accumulation of capital, government direction of the utilization of economic resources, and centralized methods of overall social planning, which might tend to smother these goals. The net result of all this has been a convergence of all three systems towards a common, if remote, system of the future. The ultimate nature of that new system of economic and social life is not yet clear, but we might call it the pluralist economy, and characterize its social structure as one which provides prestige, rewards, and power to managerial groups of experts whose contributions to the system are derived from their expertise and know-how. These managers and experts, who clearly are a minority in any society, are recruited from the society as a whole, can be selected only by a process of careers open to talent on a trial and error basis, and require freedom of assembly, discussion, and decision in order to produce the innovations needed for the future success or even the survival of the system in which they function. Thus, the pluralist economy and the managerial society from the early 40s have forced the growth of a new kind of economic organization which will be totally unlike the four types of pre-1939 American laissez-faire, Stalinist communism, authoritarian fascism, and underdeveloped areas. The chief characteristics of the new pluralist managerial system are five in number. 1. The central problem of decision making in the new system will be concerned with the allotment of resources among three claimants: A. Consumers' goods to provide rising standard of living; B. Investment in capital goods to provide the equipment to produce consumers' goods; and C. The public sector covering defense, public order, education, social welfare, and all the central care of administrative activities associated with the young, the old, and public welfare as a whole. 2. The process of decision-making among these three claimants will take the form of a complex, multilateral struggle among a number of interested groups. These groups, which differ from one society or area to another, are in constant flux in each society or area. In general, however, the chief blocks or groups involved will be A. The defense forces; B. Labor; C. Farmers; D. Heavy industry; E. Light industry; F. Transport and communication groups; G. Finance, fiscal, and banking groups; H. Commercial real estate and construction interest; I. Scientific, educational, and intellectual groups; J. Political party and government workers; and K. Consumers in general. 3. The process of decision-making operates by the slow and almost imperceptible shifts of the various blocks, one by one, from support to neutralism to opposition towards the existing division of resources among the three claimant sectors by the central managerial elite. If, for example, there is excess allotment of resources to the defense or government sector, the farming groups, consumers, commercial groups, intellectuals, and others will become increasingly dissatisfied with the situation and gradually shift their pressures towards a reduction of the resources for defense and an increase of the resources for the consumer or the capital investment sectors. Such shifts are complex, gradual, reversible, and continuous. I mean, that would be great if we could shift from the military to, like, education or something like that. That's not going to happen, though. 4. The working out of these shifts of resources to achieve the more concrete goals of the diverse interest blocks in the society will be increasingly dominated by rationalist and scientific methods, emphasizing analytical and quantitative techniques. This means that emotional and intuitive forces will play, as always, a considerable role in the shifting interest blocks which dominate the allotment of resources among the three sectors, but that rational rather than emotional methods on quantitative rather than qualitative basis will dominate the utilization of such resources within each sector for more specific objectives. This will require considerable freedom of discussion in such utilization, even where, as in communist states or in underdeveloped areas, authoritarian and secretive methods are used in reference to the allotments among sectors. And in general, there will be a very considerable modification of the areas and objectives of freedom in all societies of the world, with gradual reduction of numerous personal freedoms of the past, accompanied by the gradual increase of other fundamental freedoms, especially intellectual, which will provide the technical innovations, the clash of ideas, and the release of personal energy necessary for the success or even the survival of modern state systems. 5. The details of the operation of this new system will inevitably differ from area to area and even from state to state. In the Western Bloc of states, the shift of public opinion continued to be reflected very largely in shifting political parties. Within the Communist Bloc, these shifts will take place, as they have in the past, among a smaller group of insiders and on a much more personal basis, so that shifts of targets and direction of policy will be revealed to the public by shifts of personnel in the state's bureaucratic structure. And in the underdeveloped countries, where possession of power is frequently associated with support from the armed forces. The process may be reflected by changes in policy and direction by the existing elite and rulers who retain their power in spite of changing policies. In the most general way, the period since 1947 has shown that the differences between any two of the three blocks are becoming less. The three methods for achieving policy shifts just mentioned are becoming increasingly similar in essence and in fact, however different they continue to be in law. Moreover, in the same years since 1947, the solidarity of both the West and the Communists has been increasingly less, while the unity of outlook, policies, and interests of the uncommitted and underdeveloped peoples of the intermediary zone between the two great power blocks become increasingly unified. What? These freaking run-on sentences, man. The solidarity between both the West and Communists has become increasingly less, while the uncommitted and underdeveloped peoples of become increasingly unified. So the developed peoples become increasingly unified. Okay, that sentence was horrible. I'm sorry. The method of operation of this newly formed pluralist managerial system may be called planning, if it be understood that planning may be both public and private and does not necessarily have to be centralized in either, but is rather concerned with the general method of a scientific and rational utilization of resources in both time and space to achieve consciously envisioned future goals. See, utilitarianism, that's a problem. Like, what utilitarianism can't create goals. That's because it doesn't have any teleology to it. It's just like, okay, well, let's do it the most efficient way possible. But what are we doing? Because utilitarianism can't tell you what to do. It can just tell you how to do it in the most efficient way possible. So I don't understand what they mean by future goals. In this process, the greatest achievements have been by Western Europe and by Japan. The latter, relieved to a great extent from the need to devote resources to defense, has been able to mobilize these for investment and, to a somewhat lesser degree, for rising standards of living, and has been able to achieve growth rates of gross national product of 7 to 9% a year. This has made Japan the only area of the non-Western world and of the underdeveloped countries able to pass into the higher levels of industrialization, capable of achieving substantial improvements in individual standards of living. These improvements, held back by the emphasis on reconstruction and investment in 1945 to 1960, have shifted slowly but steadily in the past few years towards consumers' benefits, including such intangibles as increased education, sports, leisure, and entertainment. Western Europe has had an experience somewhat similar to that of Japan, except that its chief emphasis has been on improved standards of living, collectively known as welfare, with more emphasis on the defense and less emphasis on investment than Japan. As a result, Western Europe, especially West Germany, Italy, France, Scandinavia, and Britain, have, for the first time, come within striking distance of the very high standards of personal consumption found in the United States. In this process, these countries have allowed the defensive power of their armed forces to suffer for the sake of their welfare goals, but have felt safe in doing so because of their reliance on American defensive power to deter any Soviet aggression. In this process, Western Europe has achieved growth rates in gross national product of 4 to 8% a year as a consequence of three basic forces. These have been 1. The skillful and perhaps lucky use of financial and fiscal techniques which have encouraged both investment and willingness to consume. 2. the economic and technical aid of the United States, beginning with the Marshall Plan of 1946 and continuing with the United States government military aid and investment of savings coming in from the whole Western world. And 3, the growing integration of Europe's economy and the common market, which has made it possible to adopt mass production techniques for a greatly enlarged market. In this same process, the achievements of the United States and the Soviet bloc have been much less spectacular from a purely economic point of view. In the United States, where the standard of living has reached unprecedented heights of affluence, the burdens of being a superpower have hampered welfare because of the conflicting claims of defense, governmental expenses, prestige, and other rivalries with the Soviet Union, and the desire to contribute to the growth of the underdeveloped areas of the world. As a result, growth rates of gross national product have been from 2 to 5% a year, and the burden of the governmental sector, including defense and increasing demands for such welfare items as education, health, and equalization of personal opportunities, have put great pressure on the growth of the consumer sector. The Soviet bloc as a whole, apart from the Soviet Union as the dominant member of that bloc, has been ambiguous in its economic growth. The demands of the defense sector and of the other reflections of the Cold War, such as the space race, have combined with the continued failures of communist agricultural practices and the intrinsic inefficiency of the communist system as a whole to limit severely the rise in standard of living. To be sure, the standards of living in the Soviet Union itself have reached the highest in Russia's history, while still lagging only a fraction of those in the United States. But in the communist bloc as a whole, the picture has been far less happy. The non-Russian countries in the bloc have been exploited by the Soviet Union, have been treated as colonial areas, that is, sources of manpower, raw materials, and food based on claims arising from political relations, and have achieved little, if any, increase in GNP besides that needed to sustain their increasing populations. In the cases of more Western areas, such as East Germany, Hungary, and Poland, this has been reflected in absolute declines in standard of living. The sharp contrast between this and the visible boom in West Germany has greatly increased the discontent in the European satellites. The position of the underdeveloped nations has also been generally ambiguous. As a whole, lack of know-how and trained manpower, lack of capital, waste of resources by small privileged elites, absolute shortages of resources in some areas, the rapid growth of populations almost everywhere, and hopelessly unprogressive social structures and ideologies have combined to prevent any considerable improvements in standards of living. These have, in fact, decreased in much of Indonesia, the Near East, and Latin America, and have kept only slightly ahead of the growing population in India, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Only in Japan, as we have said, has there been success from this point of view, while the failure of these desires in China and Latin America have tended to lead both of these out of their former alignments with the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc towards the more ambivalent political position of the uncommitted nations. In fact, in this process, China's enmity towards the Soviet Union and the United States has tended to place her in a new position apart from all the pre-1962 alignments of international politics, while Latin America's growing discontent has tended to lead it, from many points of view, towards the position of the Near East countries. All right. All right, the next section is section 12, the policy of appeasement, 1931 to 1936. Okay, introduction. The Japanese assault, 1931 to 1941. The Italian assault, 1934 to 1936. Circles and counter-circles, 1935 to 1939. The Spanish tragedy, 1931 to 1939. I don't know how much of the section I'll get through. It's pretty long. There's no chapter breaks on. All right. It's on page 559. Introduction. The structure of collective security, which had been so imperfectly built after 1919 by the victorious powers, was destroyed completely in the 8 years following 1931 under the assaults of Japan, Italy, and Germany. These assaults were not really aimed at the collective security system or even at the peace settlements of which it was a part. After all, 2 of the aggressors had been on the winning side in 1919. Moreover, these assaults, although called forth by the World Depression, went far beyond any reaction to the economic slump. From the broadest point of view, the aggressors of 1931 to 1941 were attacking the whole 19th century way of life and some of the most fundamental attributes of Western civilization itself. They were in revolt against democracy, against the parliamentary system, against laissez-faire, and the liberal outlook, against nationalism, although in the name of nationalism, against humanitarianism, against science, and against all respect for human dignity and human decency. It was an attempt to brutalize men into a mass of unthinking atoms whose reactions could be controlled by methods of mass communication and directed to increase the profits and power of an alliance of militarist, heavy industrialist, landlords, and psychopathic political organizers recruited from the dregs of society. Wait, are we talking about America now? That the society which they came to control could have created such dregs, men who were totally untouched by the traditions of Western civilization and who were restrained by no social relationship at all, and that it could have allowed the militarist and industrialist to use these dregs as an instrument for seizing control of the state raised profound doubts about the nature of that society and about its real allegiance to the traditions to which it paid lip service. The speed of social change in the 19th century, by quickening transportation and communications, and by gathering people in amorphous multitudes in cities, had destroyed most of the older social relationships. Of the average man, and by leaving him emotionally unattached to neighborhood, parish, vocation, or even family, had left him isolated and frustrated. The paths which the society of his ancestors had provided for the expression of their gregarious, emotional, and intellectual needs were destroyed by the speed of social change, and the task of creating new paths for expressing these needs was far beyond the ability of the average man. Thus, he was left with his innermost drives unexpressed, willing to follow any charlatan who provided a purpose in life, an emotional stimulus, or a place in a group. Sounds familiar. The methods of mass propaganda offered by the press and also radio provided the means by which these individuals could be reached and mobilized. The determination of the militarists, landlords, and industrialists to expand their own power and extend their own interest, even to the destruction of society itself, provided the motive. The World Depression provided the occasion. The materials, frustrated men in the mass, the methods, mass communications, the instrument, the psychopathic political organization, and the occasion, the Depression, were all available by 1931. Nevertheless, these men could never have come to power or come within a measurable distance of destroying Western civilization completely if that civilization had not failed in its efforts to protect its own traditions, and if the victors of 1919 had not failed in their efforts to defend themselves. The 19th century had been so successful in organizing techniques that it had almost completely lost any vision of goals. Control of nature by the advance of science, increases in production by the growth of industry, the spread of literacy through universal education, the constant speed up of movement and communications, the extraordinary rise in standards of living, all these had extended man's ability to do things without in any way clarifying his ideas as to what was worth doing. Goals were completely lost or were reduced to the most primitive level of obtaining more power and more wealth. See, again, that's what I was just saying. The utilitarianism, if that's your worldview, that just doing things the most efficient way, then you don't know what you're doing. And then it just, in a capitalist society, it just becomes getting more money no matter what, because the most efficient way of getting more money is just doing anything, right? But the constant acquisition of power or wealth, like a narcotic for which the need grows as its use increases, without in any way satisfying the user, left man's higher nature unsatisfied. From the past of Western civilization, as a result of the fusion of classical, Semitic, Christian, and medieval contributions, there has emerged a system of values and modes of living which received scant respect in the 19th century, in spite of the fact that the whole basis of the 19th century, its science, its humanitarianism, its liberalism, and its belief in human dignity and human freedom, had come from this older system of values and modes of living. The Renaissance and Reformation had rejected the medieval portion of the system. The 18th century had rejected the value of social tradition and of social discipline. The 19th century rejected the classical and the Christian portion of this tradition and gave the final blow to the hierarchical conception of human needs. The 20th century reaped where these had sown. With its tradition abandoned and only its techniques maintained, Western civilization by the middle of the 20th century reached a point where the chief question was, can it survive? Against this background, the aggressive powers rose after 1931 to challenge Western civilization and the satisfied power which had neither the will nor the desire to defend it. The weakness of Japan and Italy from the point of view of industrial development or natural resources made it quite impossible for them to have issued any challenges unless they were faced by weak wills among their victims. In fact, it is quite clear that neither Japan nor Italy could have made a successful aggression without the parallel aggression of Germany. What is not so clear, but is equally true, is that Germany could have made no aggression without the acquiescence and even in some cases the actual encouragement of the satisfied powers, especially Britain. The German documents captured since 1944 make this quite evident. So again, he's just kind of saying that World War II would have never happened if it wasn't for England, but people always blame Germany. All right, so now we're on page 561, the Japanese assault, 1931 to 1941. See how far we get through this. With one notable exception, Japan's background for aggression presented a strong parallel to that of Germany. The exception was the industrial strength of the two powers. Japan was really a have-not nation, lacking most of the natural resources to sustain a great industrial system. It lacked much of the necessary basic materials such as coal, iron, petroleum, alloy minerals, water power, or even food. In comparison, Germany's claim to be a have-not nation were merely a propaganda device. Other than this, the similarity of the two countries was striking. Each had a completely cartelized industry, a militaristic tradition, a hard-working population which respected authority and loved order, a national obsession with its own unique value, and resentment of the rest of the world for failure to recognize this, and a constitutional structure in which a facade of parliamentary constitutionalism barely concealed the reality of power wielded by an alliance of army, landlords, and industry, also known as an oligarchy. The fact that these Japanese constitutions of 1889 the fact that the Japanese Constitution of 1889 was copied from the Constitution of Bismarck goes far to explain this last similarity. We have already mentioned the acute problem presented to Japan by the contrast between their limited natural resources and their growing problems. While their resources did not increase, their population grew from 31 million in 1873 to 73 million in 1939. The great rate of growth reaching its peak in the period 1925 to 1930, 8% increase in these 5 years. With great ingenuity and tireless energy, the Japanese people tried to make ends meet. With foreign exchange earned from merchant shipping or from exports of silk, wood products, or seafood, raw materials were imported, manufactured into industrial products, and exported to obtain the foreign exchange necessary to pay for imports of raw materials or food. By keeping costs and prices low, the Japanese were able to undersell European exporters of cotton textiles and iron products in the markets of Asia, especially in China and Indonesia. The possibility of relieving their population pressure by immigration with an E, as Europe had done earlier, was prevented by the fact that the obvious colonial areas had already been taken in hand by Europeans. English-speaking persons who held the best and yet unfilled areas slammed the door on Japanese immigration in the period after 1901, justifying their actions on racial and economic arguments. American restrictions on Japanese immigration originated among labor groups in California. Were a very bitter pill for Japan and injured its pride greatly. Okay. These freaking run on it's like parentheses, but they didn't put a parentheses there. Because it's American restrictions on Japanese immigration were a very bitter pill for Japan. Okay. The steady rise in tariffs against Japanese manufactured goods after 1897, a development which was also led by America, served to increase the difficulties of Japan's position. So also did the slow exhaustion of the Pacific fisheries, the growing, if necessary, restrictions on such fishing by conservationist agreements, the decrease in forestry resources, and political and social unrest in Asia. For a long time, Japan was protected from the full impact of this problem by a series of favorable accidents. The First World War was a splendid windfall. It ended European commercial competition in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. It increased the demand for Japanese goods and services. It made Japan an international creditor for the first time. capital investments in the 5 years 1915 to 1920 was 8 times as much as in the 10 years 1905 to 1915. Laborers employed in factories using over 5 workers each increased from 948,000 in 1914 to 1,612,000 in 1919. Ocean shipping rose from 1.5 million tons in 1914 to 3 million tons in 1918, while income from shipping freight rose from 40 million yen in 1914 to 450 million in 1918. The favorable balance of international trade amounted to 1,480 million yen for the 4 years 1915 to 1918. Social life, the economic structure, and the price system already dislocated by this rapid change received a terrible jolt in the Depression of 1920 to 1921, but Japan rapidly recovered and was shielded from the full consequences of her large population and limited resources by the boom of the 1920s. Rapid technological advance in the United States, Germany, and Japan itself, demand for Japanese goods, especially textiles, in southern and southeastern Asia, American loans throughout the world, large American purchases of Japanese silk, and the general boom psychology of the whole world protected Japan from the full impact of its situation until 1929 to 1931. Under this protection, the older authoritarian and militaristic traditions were weakened. Liberalism and democracy grew slowly but steadily. The aping of Germanic traditions and intellectual and political life, which had been going on since about 1880, was largely abandoned. The first party government was established in 1918. Universal manhood suffrage was established in 1925. Civilian governors replaced military rule for the first time in colonial areas like Formosa. The army was reduced from 21 to 17 divisions in 1924. The Navy was reduced by international agreement in 1922 and in 1930. And there was a great expansion of education, especially in the higher levels. This movement towards democracy and liberalism alarmed the militarists and drove them to desperation. At the same time, the growth of unity and public order in China, which these militarists had regarded as a potential victim for their operations, convinced them that they must act quickly before it was too late. The World Depression gave this group their great opportunity. Even before its onset, however, 4 ominous factors in Japanese political life hung like threatening clouds on the horizon. These were A. The lack of any constitutional requirement for a government responsible to the Diet. B. The continued constitutional freedom of the army from civilian control. C. The growing use of political assassination by the conservatives as a mean for removing liberal politicians from public life, as was done against 3 premiers and many lesser persons in the period of 1918 to 1932. And D. The growing appeal of revolutionary socialism in laboring circles. The World Depression and the financial crisis hit Japan a terrible blow. Okay. The declining demand for raw silk in competition with synthetic fibers like rayon and the slow decline of such Asiatic markets as China and India because of political disturbances and growing industrialization made this blow harder to bear. Under this impact, the reactionary and aggressive forces in Japanese society were able to solidify their control of the state, intimidate all domestic opposition, and embark on that adventure of aggression and destruction that led ultimately to the disasters of 1945. These economic storms were severe, but Japan took the road of aggression because of its own past traditions rather than for economic reasons. The militarist tradition of feudal Japan continued into the modern period and flourished in spite of steady criticism and opposition. The constitutional structure shielded both the military leaders and the civilian politicians from popular control and justified their actions as being in the emperor's name. But these two branches of government were separated so that the civilians had no control over the generals. The law and customs of the Constitution allowed the generals and admirals to approach the emperor directly without the knowledge or consent of the cabinet and required that only officers of this rank could serve as ministers for these services in the cabinet itself. No civilian intervened in the chain of command from the emperor to lowly private, and the armed services became a state within the state. Since the officers did not hesitate to use their position to ensure civilian compliance with their wishes and constantly resorted to armed force and assassination, the power of the military grew steadily after 1927. All their acts, they said, were in the name of the emperor for the glory of Japan, to free the nation from corruption, from partisan politicians, and from plutocratic exploitation, and to restore the old Japanese virtues of order, self-sacrifice, and devotion to authority. Separate from the armed forces, sometimes in opposition to them, but generally dependent upon them as chief purchasers of the products of heavy industry, were the forces of monopoly capitalism. These were led, as we have indicated, by the 8 great economic complexes controlled as family units known as zaibatsu. These 8 controlled 75% of the nation's corporate wealth, and by 1930, and were headed by Mitsui, which had 15% of all corporate capital in the country. They engaged in openly corrupt relationships with Japanese politicians and less frequently with Japanese militarists. They usually cooperated with each other. For example, in 1927, the efforts of Mitsui and Mitsubishi to smash a smaller competitor, Suzuki Company of Kobe, precipitated a financial panic which closed most of the banks in Japan, while the Showa Bank, operated jointly by the Zaibatsu, took over many smaller corporations and banks which failed in the crisis, and over 180,000 depositors lost their savings. The cabinet of the militarist General Tanaka granted 1,500 million yen to save the Zaibatsu themselves from the consequences of their greed. The militaristic and nationalistic traditions were widely accepted by the Japanese people. These traditions, extolled by the majority of the politicians and teachers and propagated by numerous patriotic societies, both open and secret, were given a free hand, while any opposing voices were crushed out by legal or illegal methods until 1930. Most such voices were silenced. About the same date, the militarist and the Zaibatsu, who had previously been in opposition as often as in coalition, came together in their last fateful alliance. They united on a program of heavy industrialization, militarization, and foreign aggression. Eastern Asia, especially northern China and Manchuria, became the designated victim, since these seemed to offer the necessary raw materials and markets for the industrialist and the field of glory and booty for the militarist. In aiming their attack at Manchuria in 1931 and at northern China in 1937, the Japanese chose a victim who was clearly vulnerable. As we have seen, the Chinese Revolution of 1912 had done little to rejuvenate the country. Partisan bickering, disagreements on goals, struggles for selfish advantages, and the constant threat to good government from military leaders who were not much more than bandits disrupted the country and made rehabilitation very difficult. North of the Yangtze River, the warlords fought for supremacy until 1926, while south of the river, at Canton, the Kuomintang, a political party founded by Sun Yat-sen and oriented towards the west, set up its own government. Unlike the northern warlords, this party had ideals and a program, although it must be confessed that both of these were embodied in words rather than in deeds. The Kuomintang ideals were a mixture of Western, native Chinese, and Bolshevik Russian factors. They sought to achieve a unified, independent China with a democratic government and a mixed, cooperative, socialistic, individualistic economic system. In general, Dr. Sun went to China's own traditions for his cultural ideas, to Western, largely Anglo-American traditions for his political ideas, and to a mixture with strong socialist elements for his economic ideas. His program envisioned the achievement of these ideas through 3 successive stages of development, of which the first would be a period of military domination to secure unity and independence. The second would be a period of Kuomintang dictatorship to secure the necessary political education of the masses, and only the third would be one of constitutional democracy. This program was followed as far as stage 2. This presumably was reached in 1927 with the announcement that the Kuomintang would henceforth be the sole legal political party. This had been preceded by 11 years of military domination in which Chiang Kai-shek emerged as the military ruler of most of China in the name of the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang, under Dr. Sun's influence, accepted the support and some of the ideas of the Communist International, especially in the period 1924 to 1927. Lenin's theories of the nature of capitalist imperialism were quite persuasive to the Chinese and gave them, they thought, the intellectual justification for resisting foreign intervention in Chinese affairs. Russian agents, led by Michael Borodin, came to China after 1923 to assist China in economic reconstruction, political education, and resistance to imperialism. These Russians reorganized the Kuomintang as a totalitarian political party on the Soviet communist model and reorganized Chinese military training at the famous Whampoa Military Academy. From these circles emerged Chiang Kai-shek, with German military advisors playing a prominent role in his activities. He launched a series of attacks which extended Kuomintang rule into the territory of the warlords north of the Yangtze River. The chief of these northern warlords, Cheng Shaolin, held his position by cooperation with the Japanese and by resistance to Russian efforts to penetrate Manchuria. As Chiang Kai-shek achieved military success in these areas after 1926, he became increasingly conservative, and Dr. Sun's program of democracy and socialism receded further into the future. At the same time, the interference and intrigue of the communist elements in the Kuomintang camp justified increasingly vigorous repression of their activities. Finally, Chiang's increasing conservatism culminated in 1927 in his marriage to a member of the wealthy Song family. Of this family, TV Song was an important banker and speculator. His brother-in-law, H. Kung, was in a similar economic position, while another sister, alienated from the family by her communist sympathies, was Miss Sun Yat-sen. Song and Kung between them dominated the Kuomintang government, the former becoming Minister of Finance while the latter was Minister of Industry, Commerce, and Labor. In 1927, the communist collaboration was ended by the Kuomintang. The Russians were expelled from China, and the Kuomintang became the only legal party. The native Chinese communists, under Moscow-trained leaders like Mao Zedong, concentrated their strength in the southern rural areas where they established themselves by agrarian reforms, expropriating landlords, reducing rents, taxes, and interest rates, and building a communist rural militia manned by peasants. As soon as the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek completed the conquest of northern China with the capture of Peking in June 1928, they shifted their attack southward in an effort to destroy the communist center in Kiangsi. The Communist Army, whose growing exactions had disillusioned its peasant supporters, retreated in an orderly withdrawal on a twisting 6,000-mile route to northern China, 1934 to 1935. Even after the Japanese attack on Manchuria in 1931, Chiang continued to fight the communists, directing 5 large-scale attacks upon them in the period 1930 to 1933. Although the Communists declared war on Japan in 1932 and continued to demand a united front from all Chinese against this aggressor for the whole period 1931 to 1937. Though the Japanese seizures of Manchuria in the autumn of 1931 was an independent action of the Japanese military forces, it had to be condoned by the civilian leaders. The Chinese retaliated by a boycott of Japanese goods, which seriously reduced Japan's exports. To force an end to this boycott, Japan landed forces at Shanghai in 1932, and after severe fighting in which much Japanese abuse was inflicted upon Europeans, the Chinese forces were driven from the city and compelled to agree to a termination of the economic boycott against Japan. About the same time, Manchuria was set up as a Japanese protectorate under the rule of Henry Pui, who had abdicated the Chinese throne in 1912. As early as January 1932, the United States notified all signers of the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922 that it would refuse to accept territorial changes made by force in violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact to outlaw war. An appeal to the League of Nations for support made by China on September 21, 1931, the same day that England went off the gold standard, passed through an interminable series of procedural disputes and finally led to a commission of inquiry under the Earl of Leighton. The report of this commission, released in October 1932, sharply condemned the actions of Japan but recommended no effective joint action to oppose these. The League accepted the Stimson doctrine of non-recognition and expressed sympathy for the Chinese position. This whole affair had been rehashed endlessly from 1931 to the accompaniment of claims and counterclaims that effective League action was blocked by the absence of the United States from its councils or by Stimson's delay in condemning Japanese aggression or by British refusal to support Stimson's suggestions for action against Japan. All these discussions together neglect the vital point that the Japanese army in Manchuria was not under the control of the Japanese civil government, with which negotiations were being conducted, and that these civil authorities who opposed the Manchurian attack could not give effective voice to this opposition without risking assassination. Okay. Premier Yuko Hamagachi had been killed as recently as November 1930 for approving the London Naval Agreement, to which the militarists objected, and Premier Kai Inukai was dealt with in the same way in May 1932. Throughout, the League discussions were not conducted with the right party. Except for its violation of nationalist feelings and the completely objectionable means by which it was achieved, the acquisition of Manchuria by Japan possessed many strategic and economic advantages. It gave Japan industrial resources which it vitally needed and could, in time, have strengthened the Japanese economy. Separation of the area from Japan, which had not controlled it effectively for many years, would have restricted the sphere of Chiang's government to a more manageable territory. Above all, it could have served as a counterpoise to Soviet power in the Far East and provided a fulcrum to restrain Soviet actions in Europe after the collapse of Germany. Unfortunately, the uncompromising avarice and ignorance of the Japanese militarists made any such solution impossible. This was made quite certain by their two major errors: the attack on China in 1937 and the attack on the United States in 1941. In both cases, the militarists bit off more than they could chew and destroyed any possible advantages they might have gained from the acquisition of Manchuria in 1931. In the 7 years after the first attack on Manchuria in September 1931, Japan sank 2.5 billion yen in capital investments in that area, mostly in mining, iron production, electric power, and petroleum. Year after year, this investment increased without returning any immediate yield to Japan, since output from this new investment was immediately reinvested. The only items of much help for Japan itself were iron ore, pig iron, and certain chemical fertilizers. The Manchurian soybean crop, although it declined under Japanese rule, was exchanged with Germany for needed commodities obtained there. For Japan's other urgent material needs, such as raw cotton, rubber, and petroleum, no help could be found in Manchuria. In spite of costly capital investment, it could produce no more than its own needs in petroleum, chiefly from liquefaction of coal. Problems led the Japanese military leaders toward a new act of aggression, this time toward North China itself. As they were preparing their new assaults, Chiang Kai-shek was busy preparing a sixth campaign against the communists still lurking in the remote northwestern part of China. Neither the growing threat from Japan nor the appeals from the Chinese communists to form a united Chinese front against Nippon deterred Chiang from his purpose to crush the communists until December 1936. He was suddenly kidnapped by his own northern commander, Chiang Su-lang, at Sian, and was forced, under threat of death, to promise to fight Japan. A Kuomintang Communist United Front was formed, in which Chiang promised to fight Japan rather than the communists and to relax the Kuomintang restrictions on civil liberties, while the communists promised to abolish their Chinese Soviet government, becoming a regional government of the Republic of China, end the expropriation of the landlords, cease their attacks on the Kuomintang, and incorporate their armed forces into the National Army of Chiang Kai-shek on a regional basis. This agreement had hardly been made and had not yet been published when the Japanese opened their attack on North China, July 1937. They were generally successful against a tenacious defense by the national government, driving it successively from Nanking to Hankow, November 1937, and from Hankow to Chungking on the remote upper reaches of the Yangtze River, 1938. The Japanese, with quite inadequate forces of only 17 divisions totaling less than 250,000 men in all areas, tried to destroy the nationalist and communist armies in China, to cut China off from all foreign supplies by controlling all railroads, ports, and rivers, and to maintain order in Manchuria and occupied China. This was an impossible task. The occupied areas soon took the form of an open lattice in which the Japanese troops patrolled the rivers and railroads, but the country between was largely in control of communist guerrillas. The retreat of the nationalist government to remote Chongqing and its inability to retain the allegiance of the Chinese peasants, especially those behind Japanese lines, because of its close alliance with the oligarchy of landlords, merchants, and bankers, steadily weakened the Kuomintang and strengthened the communists. Oops. The rivalry between these Chinese communists and the Kuomintang broke out intermittently in 1938 to 1941, but Japan was unable to profit from it in any decisive way because of its economic weakness. The great investment in Manchuria and the adoption of a policy of wholehearted aggression required a reorganization of Japan's own economy from its previous emphasis on light industry for the export market to a new emphasis on heavy industry for armaments and heavy investment. This was carried out so ruthlessly that Japan's production of heavy industry rose from 3 billion yen in 1933 to 8 billion yen in 1938, while textile production rose from 2.9 billion yen to no more than 3.7 billion yen in the same 5 years. By 1938, the products of heavy industry accounted for 53% of Japan's industrial output. This increased Japan's need for imports while reducing her ability to provide the exports, previously textiles, to pay for such imports. By 1937, Japan's unfavorable balance of trade with the non-yen area amounted to 925 million yen, or almost 4 times the average of the years before 1937. Income from shipping was reduced by militarist demands as well, with the result that Japan's unfavorable balance of trade was reflected in a heavy outflow of gold, 1,685 million yen in 1937 to 1938. By the end of 1938, it was clear that Japan was losing its financial and commercial ability to buy necessary materials of foreign origin. The steps taken by the United States, Australia, and others to restrict export of strategic or military materials to Japan made this problem even more acute. The attack on China had been intended to remedy this situation by removing the Chinese boycott on Japanese goods, by bringing a supply of necessary materials, especially raw cotton, under Japan's direct control, and by creating an extension of the yen area where the use of foreign exchange would not be needed for trading purposes. On the whole, these purposes were not achieved. Guerrilla activities and Japanese inability to control the rural areas made the achievements of a yen area possible, made trade difficult, and reduced the production of cotton drastically by about 1/3. Export of iron ore from China to Japan fell from 2.3 million tons in 1937 to 0.3 million in 1938, although coal exports rose slightly. In an effort to increase production, Japan began to pour capital investment into the still unpacified areas of northern China at a rate which rivaled the rate of investment in Manchuria. The 4-year plan of 1938 called for 1,420 million yen of such investment by 1942. This project added to the need for Japan to feed and clothe the inhabitants of North China, made that area a drain on the whole Japanese economy, so that Japanese exports to that area rose from 179 billion yen in 1937 to 312 million in 1938. Wait, hold up. Japanese exports rose from a billion yen to a million yen? What? That doesn't even make sense. It's on page 569. It says Japanese exports to that area rose from 179 billion. I think they meant million both times. 312 million. A billion is higher than a million, so even 179 billion is higher than 312 million, right? Okay. Now I'm confused. To make matters worse, the people of this occupied territory refused to accept or use the newly established yen currency because of guerrillas' threats to shoot anyone found in possession of it. All this had an adverse effect on Japan's financial position. In 2 years of the war, 1936 to 1937 to 1938 to 1939, the Japanese budget rose from 2.3 to 8.4 billion yen, of which 80% went for military purposes. Government debt and commodity prices rose steadily, but the Japanese people responded so readily to taxation, government loans, and demands for increased production that the system continued to function. By the end of 1939, however, it was clear that the threefold burden of conversion to heavy industry, which ruined the export trade, a heavy rate of investment in Manchuria and northern China, and an indecisive war with nationalist China, could not be borne forever, especially under the pressure of the growing reluctance of neutral countries to supply Japan with necessary strategic goods. The two most vital needs were in petroleum products and rubber. To the militarists who controlled Japan both politically and economically after 1939, it seemed that the occupation of the Dutch Indies and Malaya could do much to alleviate these shortages. The occupation of the Netherlands itself by Hitler's hordes in 1940s and the involvement of England in the European War since 1939 seemed to offer a golden opportunity for Japan to seize these southern regions. To do so would require long lines of communication from Japan to Indonesia. These lines would be exposed to attack from the American bases in the Philippines or from the British base at Singapore. Judging the American psychology as similar to their own, the Japanese militarists were sure that in such circumstances, America would not hesitate to attack these vulnerable lines of communication. Thus, it seemed to them that a Japanese attack on the Dutch Indies would inevitably lead to American war on Japan. Facing this problem, the Japanese militarists reached what seemed to their minds to be an inescapable decision. They decided to attack the United States first. From this decision came the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. All right. That's the end of the Japanese section there. The next section is the Italian assault, 1934 to 1936. We'll get into that tomorrow. It's really not much. I mean, it's very similar to Germany, where it's like they needed resources. They had a bunch of smart people that could build factories. They borrowed money from the United States. They built factories. They kind of helped the peasants a little bit more by raising standards of living, but that was just because it was like in the post World War I period. and then they decide to attack the United States. Sounds like a good idea. All right. Thanks for checking out the video. If you did, if you didn't, you won't hear this. Otherwise, have a good day and peace.